What is going on, everybody? I am back today to do a list video, and I'm doing this list specifically because this past weekend, the film The Monkey, directed by Oz Perkins, was released, and this is based off of a Stephen King story. I'm not sure if it's a short story or what it is. I haven't read it previously, but I thought that it was a perfect excuse to make a video talking about some of my favorite Stephen King adaptations. And King is such an interesting person for a multitude of reasons, but I think what's fascinating is he's got to be the most adapted author of all time. Like, he's had so many of his works adapted into feature-length films, some really fantastic and some not so great. And so I thought it would be fun today to tell you guys some of my favorites. Most of these I've read the book and I've also watched the movie. Some of them I've never read the book before, but still I thought it would be fun. And if I have read the book, I'll talk a little bit about the comparisons and my thoughts on like how faithful of an adaptation they are. And so let's get into it right now. So first up, I'm going to talk about my favorite, which is The Shining. And I think this one's always really interesting to talk about with King lovers and with people who are fans of Stanley Kubrick, because as far as like a faithful adaptation goes, this isn't the most faithful adaptation of a book to a movie. But what I really love about it is Kubrick takes everything that is special about the book, but then does his own thing with it, which is why I love it so much. Because if you read the book, the thing about the book is it has horror elements to it, but the Shining as a book is much more of a family drama. And Jack Torrance's character is torn apart by what's happening around him, living in this hotel, and obviously the spirits that are in the hotel that are trying to control him and take advantage of his weakness. But what's interesting about Jack's character in the book is he's constantly at war with himself about it. He's fighting his demons, and he genuinely wants to be a better person and a good husband and a great father. The difference in Kubrick's work is Jack Torrance is pure evil from the start. There is no good in that man. As you're watching the movie, you never feel any sort of semblance of empathy for him or compassion for his character. And Kubrick was much more interested in conveying pure, complete, and total evil in the movie, in comparison to the book, where you have this father who's at war with himself and trying to take care of his family, but something is getting in the way of him doing that, which is causing him to turn on his family. And I think both iterations are incredibly fascinating, but the movie, in my opinion, is far scarier. There are so many scenes in The Shining that stick out in my brain all these years later. I still remember the first time watching it, and the scene with the decrepit woman in the bathtub was one of the most horrifying things in the world to me as a young kid. The first time I watched it, I couldn't sleep for a couple of days. And even the two twin girls that are in the hallway, there's so many moments of just incredible imagery in the movie that stick out to me all these years later. It has one of my favorite soundtracks of all time. Not just incredible music that was chosen from popular artists, but also just really amazing score work in it as well. It just creates a very eerie and ominous atmosphere that never leaves you. I feel like the entire runtime of the movie, I'm completely and totally gripped to the screen and just can't wait to see what happens next. And even all these re-watches later, I still get equally as terrified when I watch The Shining. And I know King himself is not a super big fan of Kubrick's adaptation, but I don't think that really matters. I love what Kubrick did with the material. I think it's one of the greatest horror films of all time, and I always look forward to revisiting it. Up next is Misery. I actually read the book for the first time last year or the year before, and I really appreciate this adaptation because it's a very authentic adaptation. There's only some little things left out about the characters in the movie version, and I feel like everything that's left out of the movie version, it's fine. It doesn't really take away from the overall experience. And this is horror in such a different way. What I love so much about this particular situation and why this movie is so horrifying is to think about being this successful author who a ton of people know who you are and your work, and they're, you have fans, you probably have crazy fans that send you wild letters, and to literally be taken in from one of your most obsessed fans who is upset that you're abandoning the work that you've done previously to try to do something new for your career, and starts torturing you to make another book in a series you're not interested in making anymore. It's just really fascinating, and I think the commentary on that when it comes to like the creative process and being an artist and like being tormented by the thing that made you famous and wanting to put yourself out there and do something incredibly different, but that constantly coming back to haunt you. I think King writing that, thinking about who he is as an author, and like he's taken a ton of risks throughout his career to make different types of books within the horror genre, and he's done some things kind of outside of it, more fantastical realism. He's done some more gritty, dramatic work, and I'm sure as an artist that's incredibly conflicting. And so I really like what Misery represents, but I also think that it's just a really fantastic exercise in tension. And I love the way Rob Reiner builds tension throughout the movie. Kathy Bates gives one of the best performances in her career in this movie. I just feel like every twist and turn is amazing. You're on the edge of your seat for the entire runtime. And this is another one similar to The Shining that I recommend to virtually everyone because it's just a really phenomenal movie. Up next is Brian De Palma's Carrie. I love this movie, and I honestly was not that big of a fan of the book. I really wasn't a huge fan of how Stephen King told the story. I feel like, recounting the situation through like talking about like newspaper clippings and sort of things after it happens takes away a lot of the tension and suspense of the story. And I think what I really like so much about the movie is like you're constantly sympathetic for Carrie's character and learning about her background and like her crazy conservative religious mother and like all of the trauma that she experiences. You're rooting for this character throughout the entire runtime of the movie, even when she starts causing chaos in the third act, because these kids are deserving of it. They're horrible. They treat her terribly. They abuse her mentally and verbally. They're just absolutely terrible people. And I think like showcasing that through this supernatural lens of this person who everyone around them sort of underestimates who they are, and they're genuinely good deep down, but the trauma that they've experienced and everything that they've suffered in their life causes them to get to this point where they just break. And I love all the mythos kind of surrounding this, and like how Carrie obtains these powers and just sort of the mystery surrounding all of it. It's really fascinating. And I think De Palma, already being just a phenomenal director, really does a fantastic job visually. The musical choices in the movie, obviously the performances, Sissy Spacek is phenomenal in this movie. I feel like everyone in it does a really great job. And I just really like this movie a lot. I think it's taking the source material, which I think is incredibly flawed, and making it something really special. And I get why this is in a lot of people's favorite horror movies, and I think it's one of the better King adaptations. Up next is The Mist from director Frank Darabont. I read the short story of this a couple years ago for the first time, and I enjoyed it. I think it does a really great job creating this horror set piece and then creating this conflict between the people that live in this community. I think it creates a really fantastic sort of microcosm of society when you think about people splitting based on their religious views and their worldviews and ideology. But I think Frank Darabont actually takes the material and creates something far more interesting. I think it dives into the relationships of the characters and the conflict between these groups of people in a way that's far more interesting than the book. Like I said, I think the book does a really great job capturing the world, but even the emotional dynamics between our lead character and his family, like it's all done in the movie in a way that I think is very emotionally resonant. The CGI is a little bit dated years later. I have never seen it before, but I hear a lot of people talking about the black and white version of this movie, and I've always wanted to sit down and watch it to see if it hits the same way. I'm not super distracted by the outdated CGI in this movie though, because I think there's so much else going for it that makes it a really remarkable viewing experience. I also like that the movie is very dour and bleak and hopeless. When I saw the end of this movie the very first time when I watched it in my teenage years, I hated it. I was so upset by the end of the movie, and I couldn't believe that they took such an awful direction. But the more I've grown and the older I get, the more I appreciate taking that very bleak and unsettling ending, because that's unfortunately life sometimes. Life does not always work out the way that we want it to. And sometimes things get really horrible and they get very hopeless. And I think Darabont, who has made movies that encapsulate hope throughout his career, to create something so complete and utterly hopeless, it's really impressive. And this movie, I just grow to appreciate it more every single year. I think it's truly horrifying. And if you've never seen it before, definitely worth checking out. Up next is Gerald's Game from director Mike Flanagan. I read the book the first time a few years ago, and I honestly didn't like the book all that much. I found it to really overstay its welcome, and there were so many moments that I felt like really added the reading time of the book that I just found myself getting pulled out consistently. I wasn't completely enthralled, and Flanagan, being one of my favorite horror directors, does not waste any time in this movie. You are hooked from the very first frame, and I love that, considering the fact most of the movie takes place in one room with a character who is trapped, hooked up to this bed and has to try to fight for her survival. He manages to keep it visually captivating and psychologically enthralling. There are so many moments. I love that she's kind of talking to herself, our lead character, and like the vision of her dead husband, and all of these really interesting things that Flanagan does visually that really makes it a remarkable viewing experience. I love the flashbacks to her youth. I think the story overall, when it comes to overcoming trauma, and then obviously the character being put in a situation that's horrific in her real life, but that's so representative of how we as human beings carry our trauma with us throughout our lives, and that trying to rid yourself of your trauma is damn near impossible. But that the best thing that you can do is try to persevere and move forward. And I think that there's such a beauty in the message of this movie, despite it being incredibly horrific. The third act has one of the most disgusting visuals that I've ever seen in my entire life in a movie that still makes me cringe when I think about it. But that's just what makes Mike Flanagan such an incredibly special director. I love this movie. I think it is far superior to the book, and it's another way in which you can take source material and make it even better through a movie. Next is 1922. I actually read the book a few years ago for the first time as well, after already seeing the movie, and this is an incredibly faithful adaptation that I think nails it perfectly. There were a lot of people who had some complaints about this movie when it first came out. Particularly, I know a lot of people complained about Thomas Jane's accent in this movie. I wasn't bothered by it. I think what really got people caught off guard by this is there is paranormal aspects to the movie, but it is much more a drama. It's a psychological drama of a character who makes a horrible decision that plagues them for years after they make it. And I think that the movie is so symbolic of so many different things, but it's also just a fascinating character study. And I really love watching this lead character and the struggles that they experience based on the decision that they make with their young son early on in the movie. I think this is beautifully shot. I think the performances throughout, including Thomas Jane's performance, are really great. And it's a movie that I've revisited a couple of times over the years, and I've actually grown to appreciate it more. And like I said, I think so many people kind of put off by this initially solely because of the fact that it's more of a slow burn. It's not like an in-your-face, just jump scare laden fest. But I really love this a lot. I think if you're into slow burn character dramas, you'll really appreciate 1922. So I don't want to go on all day, so I'm only going to do one more for today. But the last one I'm going to talk about is the 1990 version of It. And what's really funny about this is It is a book that should be almost impossible to adapt. There's so many things that, number one, you could not convey into film form because it's just way too disturbing and uncomfortable. Asking yourself the question, why did King write that into a book? And then the stuff with like the floating turtle, like a lot of things that clearly the ramblings of a drug user at the time that he wrote this book. And it's a very difficult thing to adapt. And the 1990s version of It is by no means a perfect movie. I'm not going to tell you that this thing is immaculately made. There are a ton of mistakes in the editing and the cinematography and certain things that could have been changed, obviously, when you're making a made-for-TV movie. But what I will say about this is it's incredibly enjoyable, and I think it takes what so many people know about It and makes it very engaging. I also love Tim Curry's performance in this. I think he is incredible as Pennywise. I think he nails the character, and it's truly scary when it comes to the atmosphere of the film. I think that's what the new It films were missing out so much on. They relied so heavily on jump scares and so much less on really building tension and suspense. in specific moments. And this movie really just leaves me unsettled. I don't think the second act with the adult actors is nearly as good as the first act with the child actors, but it's still an engaging experience to watch. I think it's a fun movie. It's truly disturbing when you think about what's happening on screen. And like I said, it's not a completely and totally faithful adaptation of King's work because I think it would be almost impossible to do that. But I think it's a very enjoyable watch. And I've seen it a couple of times over the years. And when I've revisited it, I've really appreciated it. And I will probably still revisit this several times in the years to come. So, what are some of your favorite Stephen King adaptations? Let me know in the comments. These are just some of mine. I just wanted to go through some of my favorites today. As always, if you can like the video and subscribe to the channel, helps me out a lot and lets me know the type of content you're looking for. I'm always putting out new material and look forward to getting more out for you in the near future. And as always, everyone, thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.